The roadside diner buzzed with the usual lunchtime chatter. In the corner, away from the noise, sat a man with deep brown eyes that had seen more than most. His coffee had long gone cold, forgotten as he studied some papers spread across the table. The morning sun streamed through the blinds, catching on his short-cropped hair with hints of gray at the temples. The man they called Chief kept to himself most days. Not many folks in Riversdale knew much about him, except that he'd moved into the old house on Pine Road about a year back. He always had a kind word for anyone who spoke to him, but he never shared much about where he'd come from or what he'd done before arriving in their small town. What most people noticed first was his walk, a slight but distinct limp that became more pronounced when he was tired. What they didn't know was that beneath the right leg of his jeans was a high-tech prosthetic, a permanent reminder of an explosion on foreign soil that had sent him home earlier than planned. The owner of Cal's Diner, an old Vietnam vet with sharp eyes, had his suspicions about the newcomer. Something in the way the man carried himself, shoulders back, alert eyes that clocked everyone who entered, the way he always sat with his back to the wall, spoke of military training. Not just any training, but the kind reserved for elite soldiers. "More coffee?" asked Betty, the waitress who'd worked at Cal's for nearly 30 years. The man looked up and smiled, his serious face transforming for a moment. "No thanks. I'm about done here." His voice was deep but quiet, never needing to be raised to command attention. 20 years in the Navy SEALs had taught him that the loudest voice wasn't always the most powerful. He'd spent most of his career in the shadows, doing work that would never make the headlines or history books, the kind of operations that governments preferred to keep quiet. The scars on his body told stories he couldn't share. 3 tours with SEAL Team 3, 2 with Team 6, the most elite of the elite. Missions across 5 continents. Training foreign allies in techniques that might one day save their lives. And finally, that last mission in a dusty village whose name most Americans couldn't pronounce, where an IED had taken his leg but somehow spared his life. The doctors had called it a miracle. His commanding officer had called it a damned shame. After months of rehabilitation, learning to walk again, fighting through phantom pain and the mental fog of trauma, he'd made the decision to retire. 20 years was enough. He'd given his country a leg, literally, and now he wanted peace. Riversdale offered that peace, small enough that folks were friendly but respected privacy, far enough from military bases that he wouldn't constantly be reminded of the life he'd left behind. A place where he could just be a regular guide with a slight limp, not a decorated war hero or an object of pity. He gathered his papers, veterans' benefit forms that always seemed to require one more signature, one more proof of service, and tucked them into a worn leather folder. As he paid his bill, he exchanged pleasantries with Betty about the unusually warm spring they were having. Normal conversation, civilian conversation. Outside, the sun felt good on his face. He paused for a moment, letting the warmth sink into his bones. The cold weather always made his leg ache where it met the prosthetic. These first truly warm days of spring were a blessing. He was heading toward his truck when he heard them coming, the distinctive rumble of motorcycle engines growing louder as they approached the diner. He didn't think much of it at first. Riversdale sat along a popular scenic route, and riders often stopped at Cal's for their famous apple pie. But something about the particular growl of these engines made him pause. Years of training had taught him to trust his instincts, and something didn't feel right. He turned to look as the first bikes pulled into the parking lot, their riders adorned in leather cuts bearing patches he recognized from law enforcement briefings during his service. The Steel Wolves, not the worst of the outlaw motorcycle clubs, but not weekend hobbyists either. Known for drug running in the next state over and territorial disputes that occasionally turned violent. The chief sighed quietly. He just wanted a peaceful cup of coffee and to finish his paperwork. Now his instincts were shifting into high alert, a familiar tension spreading across his shoulders as he watched 6 riders dismount, laughing loudly among themselves. "Just passing through," he murmured to himself. "Let them be on their way." But deep down, he knew his quiet afternoon had just become complicated. The afternoon sun beat down hard on the parking lot of Cal's Diner, making the blacktop shimmer with heat. Chief had just finished paying his bill when the roar of engines cut through the peaceful atmosphere. 6 motorcycles pulled into the lot, their chrome parts flashing under the bright sunlight. The riders were all wearing the same leather vests with the steel wolf's patch stitched across the back, a snarling wolf's head with bared teeth surrounded by flames. The diner fell quiet as the bikers dismounted and stretched, laughing loudly among themselves. They weren't from around here, just passing through on their way to some rally up north. But they carried themselves with the swagger of men who were used to people getting out of their way. "Looks like we found lunch," said the tallest one, removing his helmet to reveal a shaved head covered in tattoos. The others nodded, following him toward the entrance. Inside, Betty the waitress looked nervously at Cal behind the counter. They'd heard stories about the steel wolves from neighboring towns, nothing good. Cal just shrugged. As long as they paid for their food and didn't cause trouble, he didn't care who sat at his tables. Chief gathered his papers and tucked them into his folder. He'd spent enough time in the diner for one day, and something told him it was a good time to leave. 20 years of military service had taught him to recognize potential trouble, and these guys had it written all over them. He stood up carefully, taking a moment to find his balance as he always did. The prosthetic leg was top-of-the-line military grade, but it still took a conscious effort to walk naturally, especially when he was tired. He nodded a goodbye to Betty, who gave him a small smile in return. She'd always been kind to him, never asking questions about his limp or his past. The door swung open just as Chief approached it, and the bikers filed in like they owned the place. They were loud, taking up more space than necessary with their broad shoulders and wide stances. The one in front, clearly their leader, was scanning the diner with cold eyes that sized everything up as either a threat or not worth his time. Chief politely stepped aside to let them pass, keeping his eyes down, not looking for any trouble. But in the shuffle of bodies moving through the narrow entrance, he bumped against one of them. A big guy with a thick beard and a patch that read "Sergeant at Arms" on his vest. The collision wasn't hard, but it was enough to make the biker spill some of his beer onto his own hand and vest. Chief hadn't even noticed the open bottle the man was carrying. "Watch where you're going," the biker growled, his voice carrying in the now quiet diner. Everyone turned to look. "Sorry about that," Chief said calmly, his deep voice steady. "Let me buy you another one." Something about Chief's composure, the way he didn't flinch or back away, seemed to irritate the biker more than the spilled drink itself. He looked Chief up and down, noticing the slight imbalance in his stance, the way he favored his left leg. "What's wrong with you? Can't walk straight?" the biker sneered. Chief took a deep breath. He'd dealt with far worse in his time. In training, they'd subjected him to sleep deprivation, psychological pressure, physical exhaustion, all to prepare him for situations where keeping a cool head meant the difference between life and death. This was nothing. "No harm done," Chief said, trying to move past. "Have a good meal." But the biker shifted, deliberately blocking his path. The other wolf members sensed entertainment coming and formed a loose half-circle behind their friend, their food orders temporarily forgotten. "I asked you a question," the biker said, stepping closer into Chief's personal space. "What's wrong with your leg? You some kind of cripple?" The word hung in the air like a bad smell. Betty gasped quietly from behind the counter, and Cal's weathered face hardened as he watched the scene unfold. Chief remained perfectly still, his face giving away nothing, but inside, his mind was running through scenarios at lightning speed, assessing threats, calculating distances, identifying potential weapons. The skills that had kept him alive in combat zones across the world hadn't faded with retirement. "I'm just trying to leave," Chief said, his voice still even. "I don't want any trouble." The biker laughed, looking back at his friends. "Hear that? He doesn't want trouble." He turned back to Chief, his smile disappearing. "Maybe you should have thought about that before you bumped into me." The temperature in the room seemed to drop as the confrontation escalated. The regular customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some pretending not to notice, others watching with wide eyes. Nobody wanted to get involved, but nobody wanted to miss what might happen next either. Chief knew he was at a crossroads. He could back down, apologize again, maybe even let this guy push him around a bit just to avoid a scene. Or he could stand his ground and risk things getting ugly. Years ago, he might have chosen differently. But he hadn't survived 3 war zones and lost a limb just to be bullied in a small-town diner. "I need you to step aside," Chief said quietly, but something in his tone had changed. There was steel beneath the politeness now, and even the dullest person in the room could sense it. The diner had gone completely silent. Even the sizzle from the grill in the kitchen seemed to quiet down, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Chief stood perfectly still, his eyes never leaving the biker who blocked his path. The man they called Razor, according to the patch on his leather vest, towered over most people in the room, but Chief didn't seem impressed. "You got a hearing problem too." Razor moved even closer, his beer breath hitting Chief's face. "I asked what's wrong with your leg." The 5 other steel wolves spread out slightly, creating a half circle that effectively trapped Chief between them and the counter. The regular customers in the diner stared at their plates or coffees, not wanting to get involved. "Nothing worth discussing," Chief replied, his voice calm but firm. "Now, if you'll excuse me." Razor's face darkened. He wasn't used to people standing their ground, especially not someone he saw as an easy target. He looked Chief up and down again, taking in his plain clothes, his close-cropped hair with touches of gray, and the rich brown skin that had seen years of harsh sun in foreign lands. "You know what I think?" Razor said loudly, making sure his buddies could hear. "I think you should show some respect when a steel wolf is talking to you." Chief didn't blink. His breathing remained steady, his posture relaxed yet balanced. To the untrained eye, he might have looked passive. But Cal, watching from behind the counter, noticed how Chief had subtly shifted his weight to his good leg, his hands loose at his sides, not clenched into fists, but ready. "Respect is earned," Chief said simply. A dangerous silence followed those words. One of the other bikers let out a low whistle. "Oh, you hear that, boys?" Razor's voice tripped with mock surprise. "The gimpy man is giving me lessons on respect." What happened next crossed a line. Razor reached out and shoved Chief's shoulder, not hard enough to knock him down, but enough to make him step back to keep his balance. When Chief's prosthetic leg didn't respond as quickly as a natural one, his movement was awkward. "Look at that," Razor laughed cruelly. "What are you anyway? Military reject? Did they kick you out when you couldn't keep up?" Something flashed in Chief's eyes then, not fear, but something far more dangerous. Years of combat experience, of life-or-death situations, had taught him to control his emotions, to channel them into focus rather than anger. But there was a limit to any man's patience. "Last chance," Chief said quietly. "Step aside." "Or what?" Razor stepped even closer, pressing a thick finger into Chief's chest. "You gonna hop away on your one good leg? Maybe call for help." The racial slurs that followed made Betty gasp and Cal's weathered hands curl into fists. Chief didn't react to the words. He'd heard worse in basic training alone, not to mention what enemies had shouted at him across battlefields. Words couldn't touch a man who had faced death more times than he could count. Instead, he did something unexpected. He smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that wolves give before they pounce, calm, certain, and utterly without mercy. "I've fought men who believed in something," Chief said, his voice still quiet but somehow filling the room. "Men willing to die for their cause. You're just a bully with a patch you didn't earn and a mouth you can't control." Razor's face contorted with rage. He wasn't used to being spoken to this way, especially not in front of his crew. His hand shot out, grabbing the front of Chief's shirt. "You don't know who you're messing with," he growled. "That's funny," Chief replied. "I was just thinking the same thing." Chief's eyes scanned the room one last time, taking in positions, distances, potential weapons. He noted the heavy ceramic mugs on the counter, the distance to the door, which of the bikers were likely carrying knives. All this in a fraction of a second, an automatic assessment born from countless missions where situational awareness meant survival. Razor pulled back his free hand, forming a fist. "I'm gonna teach you some manners." Chief sighed, almost imperceptibly. He didn't want this fight. He'd come to Riversdale for peace, for quiet mornings with coffee and a newspaper, for afternoons spent fishing at the lake. But sometimes peace had to be defended. As Razor's fist began its journey toward his face, Chief's expression changed. The calm, patient man who'd been trying to avoid conflict disappeared. In his place stood the warrior who had survived situations that would have broken most men, who had led elite teams into the most dangerous places on Earth and brought them home again. The regular customers of Cal's Diner were about to see why you should never judge a book by its cover and why appearances could be dangerously deceiving. What happened next was so fast that many of the diner's customers would later argue about exactly what they'd seen. One moment, Razor's fist was flying toward Chief's face. The next, the big biker was somehow face down on the diner's worn linoleum floor, his arm bent behind him at an angle that made onlookers wince. Chief hadn't even seemed to move. Yet there he stood, one foot placed carefully on Razor's back, holding the larger man's wrist in a grip that was firm enough to keep him down, but careful enough not to break anything. His face remained calm, almost disappointed, like a teacher who'd caught a student passing notes. "Stay down," he said quietly. "It'll be easier for everyone." The other steel wolves stood frozen in shock. Their sergeant-at-arms, a man who had broken bones in 3 different states, was pinned to the floor by someone they'd written off as an easy target. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then, as if waking from a spell, 2 of the bikers lunged forward. The nearest one reached for Chief's shoulder, while the other pulled something from his pocket that glinted in the diner's fluorescent lighting. Chief released Razor's arm and stepped back smoothly, his balance perfect despite his prosthetic leg. The first biker's hand grabbed empty air. The second one's knife slashed through the space where Chief had been standing just a moment before. "That's enough." The voice that boomed across the diner didn't belong to Chief. It came from behind the counter, where Cal stood with a shotgun pointed at the ceiling. The old Vietnam vet's hands were steady, his eyes hard as stones. "Next one who moves gets to explain to the sheriff why I had to redecorate my ceiling," Cal said, his finger resting near but not on the trigger, proof that whoever he was, he knew how to handle a weapon. The bikers froze again, but this time with angry faces, like dogs straining at invisible leashes. Razor pushed himself up from the floor, rubbing his shoulder and glaring at Chief with pure hatred. "You're dead," he spat. "You hear me? Nobody touches a steel wolf and walks away." "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Cal said, lowering the shotgun slightly so it pointed more in the general direction of the bikers. "Not unless you want to tangle with a Navy SEAL." A heavy silence fell over the diner. The bikers looked at Chief again, reassessing him with new eyes. The prosthetic leg, the perfect balance, the way he'd taken down a man twice his size without breaking a sweat, it all suddenly made sense. "That true?" asked one of the bikers, an older man who had stayed at the back of the group. "You a SEAL?" Chief didn't answer right away. He'd never been one to brag about his service, preferring to blend in rather than stand out. But Cal had changed that option for him. He corrected quietly. "Not anymore." "Which team?" the older biker pressed. "Several," Chief answered, his voice neutral. "Finished with 6. The effect of those 4 simple words was immediate. Even the regular customers who didn't know much about the military knew enough to recognize what Team 6 meant, the most elite of the elite, the unit that took down the world's most wanted terrorists, the men who operated in shadows so deep that most of their missions would never be known to the public. The older biker cursed under his breath. "Stand down," he said to the others. "All of you." "But Prez," Razor began, still rubbing his shoulder. "I said stand down." The older man snapped. "Do you know how many confirmed kills someone from Team 6 has? More than this whole club combined, I'd bet." The diner had gone completely silent again. Betty had her hand pressed against her mouth, her eyes wide as she stared at the quiet man who'd been coming into the diner for months, always polite, always leaving a decent tip. Never once had he mentioned his background. Carl lowered his shotgun completely, a slight smile playing on his weathered face. He'd recognized something in Chief from the first day he'd walked into the diner. A certain bearing that couldn't be faked, a watchfulness that never fully went away. It had taken him back to the jungles of Vietnam, to men he'd served with who moved the same way, who scanned rooms automatically and always sat with their backs to the wall. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," Chief said, his eyes moving from Carl back to the bikers. "And I'd prefer if we could all forget this happened." Razor looked like he wanted to say something else, but the older biker, the one they called Prez, stepped forward, pushing his man behind him. He studied Chief for a long moment, his weathered face giving nothing away. "How'd you lose the leg?" he asked finally. Chief hesitated at the question about his leg. He rarely talked about that day, even with the few people he considered friends. But something in the older biker's eyes, a look he recognized from his own mirror, made him answer. "IED in a village most folks couldn't find on a map," he said simply. "3 of us made it out, 2 didn't." The older biker, the one the others called Prez, nodded slowly. There was understanding in that nod, the kind that only comes from personal experience. "Let him up," Prez said, gesturing to Razor, who was still nursing his shoulder on the floor. Razor got to his feet, his face a mixture of pain and humiliation, but when he opened his mouth to speak, Prez held up a hand, silencing him immediately. "You owe this man an apology," Prez said firmly. The diner held its collective breath. Razor's face contorted as if he'd just bitten into something sour. Being told to apologize, especially in front of his brothers and regular people, was clearly not something that happened to him often. "I ain't apologizing to nobody," Razor muttered, but there was less conviction in his voice now. Prez stepped closer to him, speaking low enough that only the nearby tables could hear. "That man over there has probably killed more people than you've intimidated in your whole life. And he did it for a flag, not a patch." He paused, letting that sink in. "Now apologize." The tension hung thick in the air. Chief stood perfectly still, his face giving away nothing. He didn't need an apology. What he wanted was to finish his day without any more drama. But he understood the dynamics at play. In groups like the Steel Wolves, respect was currency, and Prez was teaching his man a valuable lesson. Finally, Razor swallowed hard and turned to Chief. "Sorry," he said, the word coming out like it physically hurt him. Chief nodded once, accepting it without comment. He wasn't one to rub salt in wounds, even if they were well-deserved. Prez stepped forward then, extending his hand to Chief. "They call me Doc," he said. Chief took his hand, noting the firm grip and the calluses that spoke of years of hard work. "Chief," he replied, using the nickname he carried since his days leading SEAL teams. "Marines?" Chief asked, recognizing something in the man's bearing. Doc nodded. "Gulf War. Nothing fancy like you Special Forces types, but I did my time." The diner began to relax as the 2 veterans talked. The other bikers backed off slightly, forming a loose circle rather than a threatening wall. Cole put his shotgun away, but kept it within reach, just in case. "You riding these days?" Doc asked, nodding toward Chief's prosthetic. "They make some good adaptations now." "Not yet," Chief admitted. "Been focusing on getting settled." Doc nodded thoughtfully. "Took me 5 years after coming home to feel like I belonged anywhere," he said. "Found these idiots about year 6. He gestured to his club with surprising affection. Razor and the others were watching the exchange with confused expressions, like children seeing their stern father having a friendly chat with a school principal. "We're heading up to the Veterans Rally in Pine Ridge," Doc continued. "Raising money for the VA hospital. Lot of young guys coming back needing help these days." Chief knew about the rally. He'd seen flyers but hadn't planned on going. Large crowds still made him uneasy, a leftover from years of training to be hyper-aware in public spaces. "Good cause," he said. Doc studied him for a moment longer, then reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a card. "Our club has a veterans chapter," he said, handing it to Chief. "Guys who served, trying to find their way back. No pressure, but if you ever want to talk to people who might understand some of what you've seen." He left the sentence hanging. Chief looked at the card. It was simple, just a phone number and the Steel Wolves logo, but with an American flag worked into the design. "I'll think about it," he said, tucking the card into his shirt pocket. Doc seemed satisfied with that. He turned to his men. "We're moving out," he said in a tone that allowed no argument. "Find somewhere else to eat." Razor looked like he wanted to protest, but a hard look from Doc silenced him. One by one, the bikers filed out of the diner, each giving Chief a wide berth as they passed. Some nodded grudgingly, a few avoided eye contact altogether. Razor was the last to leave, shooting Chief a look that said their business wasn't finished. After the rumble of motorcycles faded away, the diner slowly returned to normal. Conversations resumed, though much of it centered around what they'd just witnessed. Betty came over with a fresh cup of coffee, setting it down in front of Chief with shaking hands. "On the house," she said with a nervous smile. Least we can do. Chief thanked her quietly, suddenly uncomfortable being the center of attention. He'd spent his career avoiding exactly this kind of notice. Chief thanked her quietly, suddenly uncomfortable being the center of attention. He'd spent his career avoiding exactly this kind of notice. 3 days had passed since the incident at Cal's diner, but the whole town was still buzzing with talk about it. Chief couldn't go anywhere without feeling eyes on him, or hearing whispers as he passed. The quiet life he built in Riversdale had changed overnight. He was no longer just the guy with the limp who kept to himself. Now he was that Navy SEAL who took down a biker gang. The stories had grown with each telling. By Tuesday, folks were saying he fought off 10 steel wolves with his bare hands. By Wednesday, someone claimed he'd done it while blindfolded. Chief just shook his head and tried to go about his business, picking up groceries and stopping by the hardware store for supplies to fix his leaky roof. That afternoon, he was sitting on his front porch, enjoying the warm spring air and a cold drink. His small farmhouse sat on 2 acres at the end of a long gravel driveway, far enough from neighbors to give him the peace he craved. The property wasn't much to look at. The paint was peeling and the barn out back needed work, but it was his. After years of living in military housing or tents in war zones, having a place that belonged just to him meant everything. He was thinking about Doc's card, still sitting untouched on his kitchen counter. Part of him wanted to throw it away and forget the whole thing. He'd come to Riversdale to leave his past behind, not to join a motorcycle club full of veterans reliving their glory days. But another part, a part he didn't like to admit existed, was lonely. Missed the brotherhood, the sense of belonging to something bigger than himself. The distant rumble of engines pulled him from his thoughts. At first he tensed, wondering if Razor had gathered reinforcements and come looking for payback. But as the sound grew louder, he realized there were too many bikes for it to be just the steel wolves he'd met at the diner. Chief stood up, his hand automatically reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. Old habits. He watched as a line of motorcycles turned onto his property, kicking up dust as they made their way down the gravel drive. He counted at least 15 riders before they came to a stop in a neat formation in front of his house. His eyes scanned the group, recognizing Doc at the front, but none of the others from the diner. These riders were different. Many wore military-style haircuts, and their leather vests displayed service patches alongside the Steel Wolves insignia. Doc cut his engine and dismounted, removing his helmet as he approached the porch. "Hope you don't mind us dropping by," he called out. "Thought you might like to meet some folks." Chief remained where he was, his face carefully neutral. Quite a convoy for a social call. Doc smiled. "The Veterans Alliance rides together," he explained. "We were heading to visit a buddy at the VA hospital. Thought we'd take a detour." As if on cue, the other riders began removing their helmets. Chief's trained eye noted the details. A young man with an empty sleeve pinned at the shoulder, another with burn scars covering half his face, several with the 1,000-yard stare he knew too well from his own mirror. "Boys, this is Chief," Doc announced. "The SEAL I told you about." A ripple of respect moved through the group. One by one, they nodded or raised hands in greeting. No one approached too quickly or made sudden movements. They understood boundaries. A slight man with glasses dismounted carefully, steadying himself with a cane. "Army Rangers," he said by way of introduction. "Afghanistan, 2009. I took my right knee and part of my hip." Another rider, tall with dark skin and close-cropped gray hair, added, "Marines, Iraq. 2 tours." Around the circle they went, offering brief snippets of their service. No long stories, no dramatic details, just simple facts that said more than hours of conversation could have. Chief found himself relaxing slightly. These weren't the rowdy troublemakers he'd encountered at the diner. These were men who'd walked similar paths, who carried similar weights. "We meet Thursdays at the VFW hall," Doc said, not pushing but leaving the door open. "Talk about whatever needs talking about. Sometimes that's adjusting to civilian life. Sometimes it's just football." A younger rider with a prosthetic hand added, "They've got the best ribs in the county too." That earned a few chuckles from the group. Chief nodded, appreciating the low-pressure approach. "I'll think about it," he said, the same answer he'd given at the diner, but his tone was warmer now. "That's all we ask," Doc replied. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. There's something else we wanted to talk to you about, if you've got a minute. Chief gestured to the porch steps, inviting Doc up while the others remained respectfully by their bikes. What's on your mind? Chief asked as Doc handed him the paper. 6 months later, the morning sun shone bright as Chief led a formation of 30 motorcycles down the highway. The rumble of engines filled the air like thunder, drawing curious looks from cars they passed. At the head of the pack, Chief sat tall on his custom-modified Harley, his prosthetic leg fitted perfectly to a special pedal system that Doc's cousin had designed just for him. The back of his leather vest now carried the emblem they'd created together, a wolf's head superimposed over an anchor, with the words Project Ride Home arched above it. It wasn't an official military insignia, but to the men and women who wore it, it meant just as much. 2 miles to the next turn came Doc's voice through the communication system in Chief's helmet. Chief raised his hand in acknowledgement, signaling the riders behind him to prepare for the upcoming right turn that would take them to the VA hospital. If someone had told him 6 months ago that he'd be leading a motorcycle club, Chief would have laughed. But that day on his porch, when Doc had unfolded that paper and shown him the design for a program that would connect disabled veterans with motorcycle enthusiasts who could help modify bikes for various disabilities, something had clicked. Project Ride Home had started small. Just Chief, Doc, and a handful of veterans from the Steel Wolves Veterans Alliance. Their first project had been Chief's own bike, figuring out the right modifications for his prosthetic leg. The process had been full of trial and error, cursing, and late nights in Doc's garage, but when Chief had finally taken that bike out for a solo ride, the feeling of freedom had been worth every frustrating moment. Word had spread quickly. Veterans from 3 counties started reaching out, men and women who'd given pieces of themselves for their country and thought they'd never ride again. Chief's background as a SEAL gave the project credibility, and his natural leadership skills, honed through years of guiding teams through the world's most dangerous places, made him the obvious choice to head the operation. "Look at that turnout," Doc said as they pulled into the hospital parking lot. A crowd had gathered, nurses, doctors, and patients, many in wheelchairs, all leaning on crutches. Chief felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the summer heat. As the bikes parked in neat formation, Chief removed his helmet and nodded to a young man waiting nervously by the entrance. The kid couldn't have been more than 25, but his eyes had the aged look of someone who'd seen too much. Both legs were missing below the knee, another IED casualty from a war that seemed like it would never end. "You must be Powell," Chief said, extending his hand. The young man nodded, eyes wide as he looked at the assembled riders. "When they told me a bunch of bikers wanted to meet me, I thought it was a joke." Chief smiled. "No joke. We heard you used to ride before your deployment." "Since I was 16, Powell said, a flash of pain crossing his face. "Never thought I'd feel that freedom again." Chief turned and nodded to one of the riders, who wheeled forward a tarp-covered object. With a flourish, the rider pulled away the cover to reveal a gleaming motorcycle with extensive modifications to the pedals and balance system. "What do you think?" Chief asked. Powell's eyes filled with tears. "Is that for me?" "Take it for a test ride," Chief said. "See if the adjustments work for your prosthetics. If not, we'll keep tweaking until they do." As Powell moved toward the bike, Chief felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Razor standing there, looking uncomfortable in his leather vest that now bore a Project Ride Home patch alongside his Steel Wolves insignia. Their relationship had been rocky at first. When Razor had shown up at the VFW hall 3 months ago, Chief had been ready for another confrontation. Instead, the burly biker had awkwardly explained that his father, a Vietnam vet, had struggled with PTSD for decades. Seeing the work Chief was doing with veterans had reminded Razor of his dad's struggles. "The new guy seems happy," Razor said, nodding toward Powell. Chief nodded. "Nothing beats the feeling of getting back something you thought was lost forever." Together they watched as Powell, with help from 2 other riders, settled onto the modified bike. His face transformed with pure joy as the engine roared to life. Nearby, a news crew that had been invited to cover the event was setting up their camera. This would be the 3rd local TV story about Project Ride Home, helping to spread the word to veterans who might benefit from their services. "Never thought I'd be doing good deeds with a Navy SEAL," Razor said with a shake of his head. Chief smiled. Never thought I'd be riding with the steel wolves. Life had a way of taking unexpected turns. What had started as a tense confrontation in a small-town diner had somehow led to a brotherhood that was changing lives across 3 states. They'd received their first grant last month, money to purchase more bikes and parts for modifications, and were expanding to help veterans with PTSD and other invisible wounds find peace on the open road. As Powell circled the parking lot, his face split with the biggest grin Chief had seen in years. Something settled in Chief's chest. The nightmares that had haunted him since losing his leg hadn't disappeared completely, but they came less frequently now. The sense of purpose he'd been missing since leaving the SEALs had returned in a new form. "Looks like our next ride is going to need more bikes," Doc said, coming to stand beside Chief and Razor. "Got 3 more veterans signed up this morning." Chief nodded, watching Powell complete another lap. "We'll make it happen." The road ahead was long, but for the first time in years, Chief was looking forward to the journey.